let me introduce to you our guest speaker for today, Margaret Simmons. Margaret is an award-winning freelance journalist. She's the author of 10 books and numerous essays and articles. I hope you don't mind, Margaret, that I read some of this out, because I think the audience needs to understand your background. She's the director of the Centre for Advancing Journalism at the University of Melbourne. She's the coordinator of the new Masters in Journalism. She's the founder. Perhaps you should give us a talk on the future of journalism, because it seems to be under a lot of threat in the last little while. The age seems to have contracted down almost to a comic. We'll talk about that. Good. She's the founding chair of the Public Interest Journalism Foundation, which was established in 2009 at the Swinburne Institute of Social Research to promote and enable innovation in public interest journalism. She's the media commentator for the online news service Crikey. She's one of the principals of the Media Education Training and Advice META Centre, where she provides training services to a variety of news organisations and tertiary institutions. I'm saying this quickly because I do want to say all these things, but I don't want to take too much time. She's a freelance investigative and featured journalist, and she's a novelist and gardening writer. Now, her recent works are Journalism at the Crossroads, which was published by Scribe in 2011, and she's written a book entitled Malcolm Fraser, The Political Memoirs, co-written with Malcolm Fraser himself, and published by the Magunya Press, which is University of Melbourne Press, in 2010. This won both the Book of the Year and the Douglas Stewart Prize for Non-Fiction at the New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards 2011. Her prize-winning 2003 book, The Meeting of the Waters, which examined the Hindmarsh Island Bridge affair, won the Non-Fiction Book Award at the Queensland Premier's Literary Awards in 2003 and was shortlisted for a number of other awards. Latham's World is the new politics of the outsiders, an investigation into the then leader of the opposition, Mark Latham, published as a quarterly essay in the lead-up to the 2004 federal elections. And finally, Resurrection in a Bucket, the rich and fertile story of compost, published by Allen and Unwin in May 2004. And perhaps you'll say a few words about that very interesting title. So, with all of that introduction, I'd like to warmly welcome Ms. Margaret Simmons to talk to us today. Thank you, Margaret.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. Whenever anybody reads out my books and gets to the compost one, it always raises a laugh. And of course, the common element between my work in political journalism and my work with compost and gardening is muckraking. I'm sure that was clear to all to see. But anyway, my topic today is the future of news, and of course that does involve the future of journalism and is closely to do with the future of journalism, and I will be talking about that. But it's not only to do with the future of journalism, which I'll talk about. I've been a journalist for over 30 years now. I don't know quite how that happened. And the reason... Is that better? Let me know if you can't hear. The reason I took this job at the university, at Swinburne University before, is of course because the future of news is uncertain at a time of unprecedented change, including the future of my profession of journalism. And I want to be a part of the future, a healthy future for news and for journalism, because I think it's important. And I'm very glad to have the job I currently have at the University of Melbourne, which gives me the space and time to be able to make what I hope will be a positive contribution to that. Now, I think news is important. The quote on the screen at the moment is from an American historian, Mitchell Stevens, who wrote a quite groundbreaking book, A History of News. He brought out a new edition of it just recently, in which he looked at how the concept of news has travelled through the history of humankind. One of the interesting things he finds is that every human society that we know anything about has always had a system for passing news, forms and mechanisms and sometimes technologies for communicating news. And every human language that we know anything about has a word for news. And indeed news is one of the oldest words in the English language, and before that word gained currency there was tidings, which if you think about it means the same thing. The anthropologists tell us that two Zulus meet on a bush track, one of the first things they say to each other is, "What's news?" News, Mitchell Stevens concludes, is a basic human need. And one of our senses, as he says. Wherever people come together to trade or for other purposes, one of the things that will happen is that news will pass hands. And we need it. And there's quite a lot of information in that book about what happens to people when they're deprived of news, the stress and distress which that causes. He also says, and I think this is really interesting and important in the current day, that while we generally experience journalism perhaps as a bit of a corrosive force, journalists always holding power to account, finding problems in society, rarely offering solutions to those problems, he also says that the sharing of news over time actually has a cohesive effect. It's a subtle political force, he says, which keeps us all facing in the same direction. So you and I might disagree vehemently about Tony Abbott or Julia Gillard, but we all know who they are. We're all talking about the same things. If I talk about the National Disability Insurance Scheme, chances are that everybody in this room at least knows what that is. And that cohesive force that binds us together, even though we haven't met, is actually a byproduct of the sharing of news. Now, everything about how we share news is changing. I want to address two key ideas which I think arise from Mitchell Stevens' book and from some other studies which I'm happy to give you the details of later. Two things which we learn from history. First off, everybody shares news and information. It's a basic human function, as I've just said. But also, most societies get to a point where word of mouth on its own is not enough, where you can't know what's going on in your society about the things that affect you just from word of mouth. And history tells us that at that point, the job of the professional messenger arises. Initially, professional messengers were employed by the powerful, by governments, by the rich. Another way of thinking of that is to say that the profession of public relations preceded the profession of journalism, and is not a recent phenomenon. Spin is older than journalism. The other key idea is that history tells us the business of professionally gathering and spreading news has always been largely determined by technology. And in this respect, our own age, while it's a time of immense change, is not unique. And we can learn some things about what's going to happen to journalism and to news from thinking about what's come before. And of course, the last big innovation was this one, the Gutenberg printing press. Not the first printing press, the Chinese had it before us, of course, but the combination of our alphabet and the Gutenberg innovation changed just about everything about the way in which we choose to organise ourselves, the way in which we choose to live, the way in which we conceive of what it is to be human, the way in which we conceive of ourselves and our place in the world with our fellow human beings. And it really is worth reflecting a little while on the changes that this innovation either directly caused or made possible and enabled. Because I'm going to suggest to you that we are now living through a period of equivalent innovation. And I think that it, like the printing press, our own era, the technological innovation we're seeing now will change just about everything in exactly the same fields that I'm suggesting were changed by this. So before the printing press and the ability to spread ideas over a wide geographic area among people who had never met and who didn't know each other, there was no such thing as the public in the sense that we use that word now. No such thing as the public interest or public opinion. All of that was made possible. It took a couple of hundred years, but all of that was made possible. Martin Luther's ideas took hold through Europe because they were published, because they were able to be spread within weeks and months right across Europe. The Enlightenment was enabled, not necessarily caused, but enabled by the fact that scientists and others were able to publish their work and read the published work of other scientists. Also, and again, as I say, it took a little while, modern ideas of democracy. If you think about it, a democracy is only possible if you assume that people in the same nation who don't know each other and who are geographically remote, nevertheless share a common understanding of what the issues are and who the individuals are. And so modern ideas of the democratic state also began to grow around the printing press. And there's two strands to that history, if you like. The French Revolution was largely brewed around the illicit printing presses in the ghettos of Paris, publishing the sort of stuff that these days you would find on the front page of the London Sun, gossip about the royal family. The Boston Tea Party was planned in the front room of the editor of the local newspaper. So revolution, or radical reform, is one of the histories of the press. The other is about the growth of modern capitalism, which is also not possible. Modern capitalism is not possible without mass media. So, for example, merchants of the East India Company and others would hire a foreign correspondent to report to them through letters initially on conditions in the markets from which they were drawing their produce or selling their product. And over time, these merchants realised that it was cheaper if they clubbed together and actually published it as a little internal newsletter. That is one of the roots of the modern newspaper. And of course, all of this led eventually to modern ideas of freedom of speech and the importance of freedom of speech as an extension of the citizen's right to think and the victory of reason, the Enlightenment project, if you like. That's really the origins of that idea. And eventually, over about 2 centuries, it led to a recognisable thing that we might call a newspaper and to my profession of journalism. So an immense innovation. Now, if I'm right that we're now living through the equivalent, and I think we're quite close to the beginnings of the equivalent innovation, then we have to expect all these things to change. Not tomorrow, but certainly over time. And I suspect the pace of change is quicker now. I don't think we're looking at a couple of centuries. Okay, to continue the history of technological innovation, the telegraph led really to the modern form of news reporting. Those early correspondents wrote letters, very similar to how you might write a long letter to a friend now, starting with general solicitations and hopes for the welfare of the recipient, and the news buried somewhere in the middle. A very relaxed, leisurely style of writing. You can't do that on a telegraph, you'd wear out the fingers of the operator. So it led to the need for brevity, for putting the most important facts first. It certainly led to more immediacy, the expectation that you would hear the news within hours rather than days, weeks or months, and to much faster reactions to the news. So changing that way in which communities have that subtle cohesive force. Radio led to the ability to tell stories of all kinds, including news stories with sound. It led to the idea of the interview. If you read the first histories of newspaper journalism, they regarded doing interviews as actually in some way suspect. Much better just to stand there and observe what was happening. And there's a whole lovely discussion in Mitchell Stevens' book in which a reporter was saying, I decided I would actually ask this person some questions. Okay, but interviews, of course, were essential to radio reporting. Even more speed, more immediacy. And again, a expanding and speeding up of that subtle cohesive force that is brought by the sharing of news. Television really continued those trends, but added pictures to the mix. And then we get the World Wide Web. Now this, I think, is the beginning of the equivalent innovation to the printing press. What is actually unusual or unique about it? Well, first of all, and perhaps most significant in the long run, lowered barriers to entry. For the first, it's always been freedom of the press for those who owned one before, or for those who owned a broadcasting licence, which is an even smaller number. In our own time, and this is new in human history, anybody can publish to the world within a few minutes of deciding to do so. When I say anyone, I mean anyone with a computer, a very basic level of computer skills, and an access to the internet, which in a country like Australia is just about anybody who chooses to have those things. That's extraordinary. In a funny kind of way, it takes us back to pre-printing press days. Before the printing press, before literacy, everybody's ability to spread news and information and ideas was roughly equal. We know from study of pre-literate societies and from history that even in those societies, some people became recognised as more reliable messengers, as better informed, as more reputable, as having better judgment. So even there, some people gained privileged positions, but the power to publish was roughly equal. And although, of course, the printing press and all these other innovations brought immense advance, it also made the ability to publish less democratic as time went by. Freedom of the press for those who owned one. One of the most significant innovations the World Wide Web brings is takes that right back to a situation where everybody has a roughly equal ability to publish. Getting noticed is something else, of course, and I'll come to that. Okay, the other thing is that whereas once I would have been teaching a course in broadcast journalism over here and a course in print journalism over here, now they converge. The Age publishes video on its website. Channel 9 publishes text on its website. These days we just teach the skills. We teach video skills and audio skills and text skills. We don't teach them as separate elements. Media has converged. Even more immediacy, even more speed. Because of the ability to publish instantly, you no longer do what I used to do, or the experience I used to have when I started in journalism, when the Age would be published at about midnight. I would leave the building, often at about midnight, and find people queuing up outside the building to get a copy of the paper. That's how keen they were on my journalism. Well, it wasn't my journalism, of course. It was the classified ads, which paid my wage. And we'll come to that. But what an old-fashioned idea that is. That is. Only 30 years ago, less than 30 years ago, people queued up to get the paper hot off the press for a combination of classified ads and news. In both those cases, what an incredibly old-fashioned thing to do, isn't it? It's almost inconceivable that people did that only a little while ago. Now, of course, if you wanted to search for classified ads, you'd be online, and you can do it whenever you want, likewise the news. So, this is the beginning of huge changes. Even more up to date, and kind of right now, we have the growth of social media, by which I mean Facebook, Twitter, Google+, and Foursquare, which actually is failing to take off. I probably should take that graphic off. Now, I don't know how many of you are on social media, but when I ask a class of my students, who are mostly postgraduates, so mid-20s, and I say, how many of you are on Facebook, every hand goes up. How many of you are on Facebook? Okay, so probably about 50%, I think. That's a little under 50%. Okay. So Facebook, at least, is pretty mainstream. A lot of people are on it. What actually is social media? Well, it's basically about community. It's about publishing. It's about publishing news and information, usually about yourself and only of interest to your friends and family, and maybe not even that. But it is about publishing news and information, and it's about connecting with other people who are interested in the same things you are interested in. For most of us, that will be our friends and our family. But if you're interested in digital cameras, there is an international Facebook group for you. If you're interested in compost, there are dozens of international compost groups, and I'm a member of most of them. Okay? Whatever your interest, you will find a group with whom you can share news and information on social media. And people are, at an increasing rate. Twitter, even more recent, wasn't even with us 5 years ago, is become an enormously important journalistic tool. Not because it's mainstream, it isn't yet, but because most journalists are on it, most politicians are on it, most opinion makers and influencers are on it. And if you want to be part of those conversations, you can be in a way that was not possible before. So, for example, you can directly address a journalist. You can directly address Lee Sales about what she did on the 7:30 report last night. Okay? This was not possible before, and it will change everything. Now, of course, the downside to all this technological change is that it is undermining the business models that have supported me for most of my career and support most of what we still tend to think of as journalism. And the reason is exactly what I talked about earlier. Nobody queues up outside the Age anymore to get a paper hot off the press for the classified ads. In fact, there hardly are any classified ads anymore. And for most of the Age's period of golden age, if you like, it was the classifieds which made that possible. What a wonderful source of revenue. Everybody paying for their little 3 or 4 line ad, none of them big enough to be able to influence your editorial line, or caring indeed about your editorial line, just wanting to sell their car or flat or advertise their job. Pages after page after page after page of classified ads, and all that revenue falling pretty much straight to the bottom line. It was a glorious period, and I was there, but it's over. It's over. All over the world, similar elements of this are happening. Popular newspapers, by which I mean ink on dead trees, are dying. We don't know when exactly, but the CEO of Fairfax, Greg Highwood, has already said that the broadsheets, The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, which are that company's best known products in this city, will not be publishing on paper midweek within 5 years. Personally, I think it will be sooner than 5 years too. I think we're really talking about the next couple of years when that change will happen. They will still, of course, be publishing online, but you cannot earn the same sort of money from an advert online as you can from an advert printed on paper and tossed over a fence. And we see the same thing happening right across the Western world, not interestingly in India or in China, where you see quite different trends happening, but certainly in the USA. Roy Greenslade, who's an American scholar in journalism, has predicted that they will die very soon. He said about 2015 for the last printed newspaper. Now, I think he's probably wrong about that. I think they'll survive a few years past that, but we are definitely at the end of that period. Now, this matters not so much because of the platform. The content is still there, but because of the revenue model, the business model. And that's what pays the salaries of the journalists. Television isn't immune from this. TV relies on gathering an audience, commercial TV I mean by this, not the ABC, relies on gathering a large audience together in one place and selling their attention to advertisers. When I was growing up, when most of us were growing up, the family gathered around the 6 o'clock news. And most people would stay on with that channel through the evening, which meant that you could sell the advertisements for a very high price. These days, I live in a family of 3. We have 3 televisions in my household. The number of occasions on which my children and I gather together around the same screen is tiny, and that's before you take account of the fact that we all have iPhones, I have an iPad, they have a home computer, masses of screens, and all of us having our individual media experiences separately. The figures tell us that about 65% of Australian households have at least 2 televisions in them. And when you take into account that about 25% of Australian households have only 1 person in them, you're beginning to get the picture. So the number of occasions on which we gather together as a big audience is much smaller. There still are a few. The grand final, for example, The Voice is one such occasion. But it's not the 6 o'clock news anymore. The idea of gathering around the TV at 6 o'clock to find out what happened today is about as old-fashioned as the idea of queuing up outside the Age. And that means that the revenue model is broken. And you've seen Channel 9 in financial difficulty, Channel 7 in financial difficulty, and Kerry Stokes, in whom, as has been described, I have a particular interest in slightly less difficulty, but nevertheless earning most of his money from tractors and earth-moving equipment. So all of this has led, don't worry, I'm going to cheer you up later, all this has led to some pretty grim figures. We can only estimate the number of journalists who've lost their jobs in Australia, but this is the best estimate that I'm aware of. 13% of big loss in Australia, and these figures, I have to say, preceded the massive redundancies that we saw in the middle of last year. So that's pretty grim. However, there are plenty of jobs in journalism. Many of them are flying beneath the radar because they're not where they used to be. They're not in the big industrial news complexes of The Age or the Sydney Morning Herald. They are in many, many start-up enterprises operating on new media. But I'll come to that. Just keep an eye on the time here. So to sum up what's gone wrong, business models have collapsed or are threatened, readers are moving all over the place, classifieds have disappeared, the audience fragments and is many different places at many times, and the rate that you can charge for an ad falls. Politically, of course, the implications are that we're beginning to lose, possibly, that subtle cohesive force that comes from us all reading the same news. If I'm reading my blog on compost and you're reading your blog on digital cameras, will we actually, in 50 years or 100 years' time, share that common understanding, a common front page of issues, if you like, on which we decide how to cast a vote? It's an important question. At the same time as the technological changes have happened, the ownership structure has also altered. We used to have media empires. We used to have people like Packer and Rupert Murdoch, who, whatever their faults, cared about content. Packer supported the Bulletin magazine for years when it didn't make a profit, and the Channel 9 Sunday programme, which never made a profit. Rupert Murdoch is still supporting the Australian newspaper, which doesn't make a profit, in fact makes substantial losses. They do this because, for whatever reason of political power, kudos and ideology, they care about the content. But these days, Channel 9, once owned by the Packer family, now owned by banks. Fairfax, once owned by the Fairfax family, now owned largely by institutional investors, and they care only about the bottom line. They don't care about content necessarily for its own sake, only if they can see a way of monetising it. That's a huge change. We're living at the end of the era of media emperors. And just like all empires, there's been both good and bad with that empire. I'm reminded of that film, The Life of Brian. You know, what did the Roman Empire ever do for us? Well, in this case, freedom of speech, supporting large journalism, staff and so on, but also, of course, influencing the political debate in ways which were not always positive. Some other things that are happening. Jobs are disappearing and losing their geographical base. Sub-editing, that is, the writing of the headlines and the captions, has been outsourced from our main news organisations and already is beginning to move offshore. Fairfax at the moment is looking at taking the sub-editing or production work of its papers to India, to Mumbai, where it could be done more cheaply. Reporters, once given the luxury of working on one story or maybe 2 stories a day, are having to do 3 or 4 or 5, and they're having to do the video and the audio and file to the web, which means a constant deadline rather than that one, in retrospect, luxurious thing of only having to beat one deadline a day. And also with the multiple platforms, you're beginning to see the same content cut and pasted and used in many, many different ways. There are many different forums. Now, in response to all this, you may all be aware that our main news organisations, our main newspapers, are hoping to encourage you to pay for subscriptions. Fairfax will make an announcement in the next week or so about making you pay to access The Age online. The Australian already does, the Herald Sun already does. So one of the huge questions that everybody from Rupert Murdoch downwards is worried about is, what will people pay for? Will they pay? What will they pay for? And how much will they pay? Probably we're going to see these paid sites become less mass media and more highly targeted media. And they'll become a little bit like social clubs, in which you will get access to high quality information because you pay a subscription, and somebody else might not have that access. There's a risk there of creating an information underclass, and again losing that subtle cohesive effect. Mark Day, of course, is the media commentator for The Australian, and this is what he said before The Australian put up its paywall, that the readers of The Australian would become like a social network, which would share not only news but also services, access, entertainment and so on. So a bit like a private club, if you like. Okay, so having depressed you all thoroughly, I'm going to cheer you up. It is important to remember where the crisis is and where it isn't. There is absolutely no evidence of a declining appetite for news and information. It really serves re-emphasising this, because you will hear people claim the reverse. You will hear them say newspaper readership is declining. It's not true. Not at all true. The reverse is true. The Age has more readers now than it has ever had before. The Age has more readers now than it has ever had before. So does the Herald Sun. Okay? Because if you add together those who are still getting the dead tree thrown over the fence every day, and those who are reading online and on Facebook and on Twitter and through all the other platforms, that number is larger than it has ever been before. The crisis is not in the appetite for news and information. Given what we know of the history, we can be confident that people will still want and need news and information. And on this we must build. So. The other cause for optimism is that we've never had so many media adepts. Does anybody remember Shane Paxton? Yeah, Ray Martin's victim, if you like, a victim of tabloid television in the mid-1990s, again, very recent. Shane Paxton was a young man who was unemployed and who also, like many young men, used to sleep in till mid-morning. Ray Martin made a victim of him, sending in the camera crews, holding him and his family up for ridicule over 2 or 3 episodes on national television for being supposedly a dog bludger. You can still find those programs on YouTube if you want to look, and it's really interesting to see this young man totally unaware of what's being done to him, totally a victim of the norms of tabloid television news. Now, Shane Paxton has gone on to build himself a perfectly reasonable life. He really was just an average young man, I think. But at the time, he and his family were pilloried in the national media and were powerless. Think forward to 2008, only just over 10 years later. Do you remember Corrie Worthington, the party boy? Yeah, he held a party which got out of control. I mean, that's never happened before, has it? But once again, was a victim of tabloid television, except he wasn't a victim. You may all remember the interview that he did wrapped in his doona with his glasses, and he was asked, you know, take off your glasses and apologise. Take off your glasses and say you're ashamed. I'll apologise, I'm not going to take off my glasses. Corrie Worthington was in control. He understood exactly what was being done to him, and within 24 hours had established a Facebook page and set up a business as a party organiser. And is still working at that. Now that's the difference 10 years makes in terms of generations. Okay. Throw forward another 5 years and the students who enter my journalism program are already the media. They are already posting videos to YouTube, news on their Facebook pages, conversation on their Twitter sites, often running blogs. And they will never be victimised by those old-fashioned forms of media in quite the same way that somebody only 10, 15 years ago was. Now, you might not like Corrie Worthington, but I think that's possibly a healthy thing. What's succeeding? Well, here's a few things that succeed. 9MSN is Australia's most popular website. And most significant, I think, almost half of the visits come in sideways, which means people go online not to a particular site, but searching for information and find their way all over the place as a result of those searches. So it's a much less passive form of news consumption. Nearly 7% of Australian internet users go online to gather news, and I have to say that in our region we are way behind on that. I was in China recently. Those figures are much higher for China. The Chinese are much bigger users of social media than we are. So are the Malaysians, so are the Indonesians. We're actually a bit backward in this area in Australia, something a lot of people don't realise. Here's some of the other things that are happening at the moment. Paywalls for major newspapers online. We don't really know whether it's going to work. It's working for some, such as the New York Times. Also, the AFL, and indeed every other large business, is becoming a media outlet because they can all publish, which leads to a blurring line between the spin doctors and journalism. Not a new problem, but perhaps newly urgent. We see increasing use of Twitter and social media as tools and platforms. We're seeing Fairfax Media pull back from print, and I think that's going to happen very quickly now. We're seeing a shrinking of the big industrial media enterprises and a growth in media as cottage industry. Small enterprises, often one journalist, publishing to the world using the web. And while many of them are not viable and will not last, some of them will, and it's growing exponentially. It's where most of my students will find their jobs, in the cottage industry of news media. Here's an example of what works in the USA, which went through our current crisis about 7 years ago. The Journal Register Company quite like Fairfax in some ways. It has a couple of big city newspapers and a strong regional network of newspapers. And they have begun to do things like hold their news conference and open it to the public in a local community, so people can actually go in and directly contribute to what that news community is going to do. They live stream their news conference. They take suggestions from the public using Twitter and Facebook. They've opened a cafe, not outside the media newsroom, as you'll see at the ABC or at Fairfax, but in the heart of the newsroom. So ordinary members of the public can go in and have a coffee. They have training courses there for bloggers. In other words, they've opened themselves to what the web is actually good for, which is society, community, that subtle cohesive force. We've yet to see that kind of thinking in Australia. I'm rushing a little bit because I do want to leave time for questions, so I'll leave that. So there's all sorts of potential there. One of the career paths for my students is to go and find an audience that's in need of journalism and begin to serve it. And I don't think there's any doubt about this one, that Australia is radically underreported. All of you live in suburban streets, will have questions about what's happening in your community, but you've got more chance, I would suggest, of finding out what happened in the White House last night than you have about finding why the ambulance called at the end of the street last night. Australia is a radically underreported nation. So I just want to finish by giving you a little capsule of what's happening to young people who want to enter the extremely important and ancient occupation of the professional messenger. Now, my little degree is only a microcosm of this, but I do think it's representative. I've taught in other universities in Australia as well. We only launched last year. We had 20 students at the beginning of the year. This is postgraduate journalism study, and another 7 joined us mid-year. So a total of 27 students last year, more than that this year. But of those first students, only 2 so far completed their degrees, and they did that because of recognition of prior learning. So most have yet to graduate, but already they're getting jobs. Here's a list of the jobs that those students who started last year have gained. A social media manager for a media outlet. 2 of them have that job. It didn't exist even 2 years ago, that job. We have a research assistant to a major author, who's in this room. Another research assistant to a freelance journalist, regional newspaper, private media partners, which is the stable of publications which produces Crikey, among other things, Business Spectator. Now, I've counted one as having a job. In fact, he's going for an interview this Friday, but I'm pretty confident he's going to get it. 9MSN, which again is a relatively new site. So a total of 10 jobs or paid work in the industry out of 27 students who started last year, most of whom have not yet graduated. Some other interesting facts. The student who got a job at Business Spectator managed to gain their attention by building his own blog. He was passionate about business reporting, in which he reported on business in his local area, in the city of Stonington. He started that as a classroom exercise. The editor of Business Spectator noticed what he was doing and called him in for an interview. One of the students who's managing the social media presence of a mainstream media outlet has been credited with increasing its circulation by 35% through his use of social media. That's an astonishing statistic, but that's what they tell me. Yeah, this is by tweeting and Facebooking and blogging and being active in the online communities. Okay. The other thing I'd point out is that of those jobs, 7 of those jobs simply didn't exist 5 years ago. There was no such thing as a social media manager. There was no such thing as Business Spectator. This is not a dead job market. So to sum up, and I do want to leave a little bit of time for questions, the future of news is assured. Human beings will always share news. My profession was a creation, or if you like, a side effect of technological change, and it will be changed by technology. A little while ago, Julian Assange got an award for biggest contribution to journalism, and there was a sort of mini controversy among the half dozen people in this country who are interested in this sort of thing about whether he was or wasn't a journalist. Well, the truth is journalism is changing. It's a moving target. Journalism is not now what it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and it's going to continue to move very fast. But we will continue to have means of spreading news and information. Our communities may be more fragmented, but they will also be international. There is enormous opportunity in this and great threat. And the reason I'm in my job at the moment is because I want to be part of making the most of those opportunities and hopefully doing something about the threats. Very happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret. And do we have any questions from the audience? Yes, please.
You can tell how out of date I am by this question. I'm worried about archival retrieval in all this. There was an interesting article, I think about 6 months ago in the Green Guardian on this very point, and not before time. Already you get lots of articles that aren't in the social part of the media, but in politics, economics, etc., which is argot, which may not be recognised in 3 months, let alone 300 years. And then you have the problem of the technology itself changing so that you cannot read something that appeared relatively recent. What happens about this whole important area?
Well, again, I think there's both threat and opportunity, because on the one hand, things are more searchable than ever before, so it's much easier to search an archive that is available online than it would have been to search a physical archive. But I know, and it's not particularly my area, but I know I have friends in librarianship and archival work who are very actively considering exactly this issue at the moment. How do we maintain the archival record? The National Library Archives website has a long list of websites which it is regularly maintaining records of, so that will be available for future generations. Storage in many ways is easier. It's easier to make sure the photograph, for example, is stored and preserved even when the physical artefact has begun to decay. So there's a lot of upside in that, and certainly search is enormously effective. For example, just one example that I do know about as a journalist, Hansard. Once upon a time, if you wanted to search an old copy of Hansard, you would have to physically go to probably the State Library, access it, and do the best you could to find what you're interested in. Now you can search it online with a single word in a few minutes. Company searches, likewise, it used to involve me in a one-day trip to corporate affairs. Now I can do it on my desk in 5 minutes online. Undoubtedly we will also lose some material, but increasingly archivists are spending most of their time thinking not only how to preserve it, but also to make it searchable. The National Archives, for example, where I've spent many years of my life researching Malcolm Fraser, among other things, are increasingly digitising their documents so you can access them from anywhere, and so they're preserved.
Can I just ask a supplementary to that? It's all very well searching now, but if the program is out of date, kaput, then what? How do you search a program that isn't searchable in effect, as I see it?
There's a whole branch, again it's not my area particularly, but there is a whole area of the software industry around creating new software to read old software, if you like. I know that sounds bizarre, but there you go.
Given the extent and the speed of change, is there some sort of mechanism for drawing a distinction between the presentation of facts, this happened here on that date, from the background, I won't say bias, of the presenter?
Well, bias, of course, is in the eye of the beholder, but that's in a sense that's not a new question. It's relatively new. People have only worried about objective reporting since about the early 1800s. It used to be a given that newspapers were opinionated and reflected the opinion of the editor, and nobody saw anything wrong with that. The idea of objective reporting is actually a very recent invention. It is one of the things that's under strain. You'll find heaps of opinion online, actual hard reporting, simply going out and saying this is what so-and-so said at such and such a forum, is what's threatened and what we have to try and protect. But, you know, what is bias, what is objectivity? These are very important questions which I have long answers to and not going to give them here. But it's really, I think, in a nutshell, slavishness to the evidence. It's part of the Enlightenment project of saying it's possible to go out into the world and find out facts about it, quite an old-fashioned idea in that sense. And I think true objectivity lies not necessarily in the individual journalist, not necessarily even in the final product of the journalism, but in the willingness to follow the evidence whether or not it meets your preconceptions. And that's a really important skill and a really important principle of journalism that we must work to preserve.
Perhaps if I may just ask a question related to the quality of journalism. And I mean, if you take Baker and McKenzie from The Age, they have an absolute zeal about revealing some hidden mystery and scandal that's going on in society. They do it repeatedly, they repeatedly get awards for it, Wakely's and God knows what. But I question their zeal, I question their bullying tactics in a way. I regard them as bullying journalists because I think they cross the line. They use secret sources and they report on their secret sources. They never reveal the source. And to me, that, yeah, sure, it's something that led to the uncovering of Watergate, that type of secret reporting, and we need that, those secret sources, if you like, whistleblowers. But there's a lot of issues around whistleblowers and the objectivity and truthfulness of the whistleblowers, and I think Baker and McKenzie, in my opinion, don't have a great balance in the way they judge the source of their material, so that the sources, we never know. Some of their material becomes truth, you know, it's revealed as something that did happen, but much of what they write, it turns out to be fiction, but unfortunately they do a lot of damage along the road while they produce all this material. It's the damage that they cause that I regard as bullying. I'd like you to comment on that. The quality of journalism in Australia, with those two as a prime example of where they are at the extreme of what I would regard as dubious reporting in some of what they do, at least.
Well, I'm not going to comment on Baker and McKenzie as individuals. I think that's probably.
I'd expect you to.
I think that's probably a longer conversation you and I would need to have, and I'd need to know exactly which things you're thinking about in their reporting. But I don't think there is anything in your question which is relevant to the changing of technology. I'm old enough to remember Bob Bottom, for example. Some of the rest of you will remember that, and the Age tapes, and Lionel Murphy, and all that, which was enormously controversial at the time. And there would be people who would still say that Lionel Murphy was the victim of a witch hunt that was unjustified and inaccurate reporting. Bob Bottom was certainly attacked and, in the end, greatly damaged by people who thought he was too zealous and lost perspective in his reporting. So even if what you say is true, and I'm not necessarily saying it is, it's not a new phenomenon, the measure has to be the evidence. That is always the measure. As I say, journalism is part of the ongoing enlightenment project. And we do need journalists who can remain dispassionate and follow the evidence. But we do also need journalists who are passionate, because frankly, journalists usually are not paid the sort of money which means that you're going to do that dirty work, and a lot of it is dirty work, for no recompense. They're going to do it because they're motivated by a belief that it's important. Now, the risky side of that is people who lose perspective and become zealots and campaigners, but you do need some of it as well. One of the worries about the decline of the mainstream newsroom is that we might lose the norms of the newsroom, the tough editor who could stand up to a Baker and McKenzie or to a Bob Bottom or to any journalist and say, well, no, go back and do that again, find out more, question that source. In terms of confidential sources, I think it's always an awkward thing. Basically what you're saying with journalists using confidential sources is that you are having an unauthorised disclosure, and there is something innately uncomfortable about that. And yet at the same time, if journalists don't talk to confidential sources, and I would do it most days of my working life when I'm working as a journalist, then you'll never find anything out other than what people want you to know, the press release. But it is innately an ethically difficult interaction, and I don't think journalists are sufficiently reflective about it as a general rule. But that doesn't mean to think that I think they shouldn't do it.
Thank you for your very considered answer on that. Maxine?
Margaret, I think you're right to characterise where we're heading to the cottage industries, which raises all sorts of interesting questions. And it was one of the reasons that technology helped us get into the Industrial Revolution. Out of the cottage industries have become more efficient and the rest of it. It's given us the lifestyles that we all have. So it's one set of issues. But I'm just wondering how you see the perhaps the political implications of this with smaller and smaller, I would argue, specialist networks talking to each other and across countries, with perhaps, you know, specialists in Australia having more in common with specialists in India, that kind of thing. That's another level of fragmentation. So there's the question of what this means for kind of national sovereignty and the ability of national leaders. And if I agree, I think we're that far behind the US. If I could give the example of Obama, for instance, spectacularly successful at campaigning to niche groups all over the country and building up coalitions that delivered him two very, you know, outstanding successes. But it hasn't helped one iota in allowing him to govern.
Yes.
Any comments on that?
Yeah. Well, all of those are absolutely the questions, Maxine, I would agree. You know, I think, as I indicated, the printing press changed our ideas of the nation state, changed our, well, created democracy, really, or enabled the creation of democracy, and all those things will change too. You know, I think people are constantly at risk of underestimating the quantum of the change we're facing, and we are right at the beginning of it. So in 100 years, 150 years, will we still conceive of nation states in the same way? Will we still have democratic forms that look anything like what we have today? I don't know. I think all of that is in play. Certainly, I think it will be changed by it. Before the printing press, people identified primarily not with their nation, but with their clan or their village or their community, and it was geographically bound. Our children's children may well not identify mostly as Australians, but rather as IT professionals or activists on some issue, or probably some complex interweaving mix of that. How do we run a democracy, a national democratic model within that? I don't know. These are really important questions. In terms of the use of social media for governing, I agree that it hasn't worked for Obama by and large. There are little exceptions to that, but as a general picture. And I think we have to get much better. And I think this is the new mission of journalism, actually. I think if we want to reinvent fourth estate ideals, if you like, it is around making sure that we connect, only connect, as somebody else at Ian Forster said. So make sure that the person reading the gardening blog written in the USA and the person reading the digital camera blog written in China actually connect at some point. Connecting all these different media experiences is the new mission of the journalist, I think. And really, journalists have to become community workers. It is now largely community work, and we have the tools. We have the best tools that anybody in human history has ever had to do that work. That's only the beginning of an answer.
Well, look, thanks very much, Margaret, for spending time with us today and sharing your wisdom and experience and this very fascinating topic, which we all need to come to grips with clearly. I think I'll have to go on Twitter now. But we want to just, first of all, if you wouldn't mind putting your hands together.